I watched in complete shock as the auctioneer raised his hammer. My family ranch, worth over $300,000, was about to be sold for $25,000. The HOA board members stood in the back of the room with satisfied smirks on their faces. They knew exactly what they were doing. "Going once, going twice," the auctioneer called out. I tried to scream, tried to object, but my lawyer grabbed my arm and shook his head. It was too late. The legal system had failed me completely. The hammer came down with a sound that shattered my heart. 40 acres of my family's legacy, gone in an instant. Property that had been in our family for 60 years, stolen by people who had never even set foot on the land. That is when I realized they had been planning this theft from the very beginning. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and scrolling through emails. The voice on the other end was professional but kind. "Is this regarding Uncle Harold's estate?" I asked, my heart sinking. I had not spoken to my great-uncle in years, but I knew he had been sick. "Yes, I am sorry for your loss," the estate lawyer said. "Your uncle named you as the sole beneficiary of his ranch property. It is 40 acres in Cedar Valley, about 2 hours north of where you live." I nearly dropped my coffee cup. Uncle Harold had a ranch. I had vague memories of visiting him as a child, but that felt like a lifetime ago. The lawyer explained that the property had been in our family since the 1960s, when Harold first bought the land and built a small farmhouse. "The property is valued at approximately $320,000, she continued. "Your uncle was very clear in his will that he wanted the land to stay in the family." 2 weeks later, I made the drive to Cedar Valley for the first time in 20 years. The winding country road led me through rolling hills covered in oak trees and wild grass. When I finally reached the property, I had to pull over and just stare. It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. The farmhouse was small and weathered, but it had character. Wraparound porch, red tin roof, windows that looked out over endless green pastures. The barn was old but solid, and there were remnants of fencing that spoke to decades of ranching history. I walked the property for hours that first day. Every step felt like a connection to family history I had forgotten existed. I found old horseshoes, pieces of farming equipment, and a small cemetery plot where Uncle Harold had buried his dogs over the years. Each grave marker was hand-carved with love and care. In the farmhouse, I discovered boxes of family photos and documents, pictures of Harold as a young man working the land with his hands, photos of family gatherings I barely remembered, letters from relatives, some dating back to the 1970s. The ranch was not just property. It was a piece of our family soul. The estate lawyer met me there that afternoon to handle the paperwork. She walked me through the property deed, the tax records, and the maintenance history. Harold had paid his property taxes faithfully every year. He had maintained the well, the septic system, and the basic electrical work. The property was completely debt-free. "Your uncle was very proud of this place," she told me as we stood on the front porch. "He always said it was his greatest accomplishment. He hoped someday the family would come back and appreciate what he had built here." That night I sat on the porch steps and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. For the first time in years, I felt truly peaceful. I had been stuck in a dead-end job, living paycheck to paycheck in the city. This ranch represented freedom, a chance to start over, to build something meaningful with my own hands. I started making plans immediately. The farmhouse needed work, but it had good bones. New plumbing, updated electrical, fresh paint, and it could be a perfect home. The land had potential for small-scale farming, maybe raising a few cattle or horses. I could work remotely and build a sustainable life away from the stress and noise of urban living. Over the next few weeks, I visited the ranch every weekend. I measured rooms, researched contractors, and dreamed about my new life. I even started telling friends about my inheritance and my plans to eventually move to the country. Everything felt perfect. I had no idea that someone else had already made plans for my property, plans that would turn my dream into a nightmare. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, mixed in with my usual bills and junk mail. The return address read Cedar Valley Homeowners Association in official-looking fonts. I stared at it, confused. There had to be some mistake. I tore open the envelope and read the first few lines. My blood went cold. Notice of outstanding HOA fees and violations. Property address, 1247 Old Ranch Road. Total amount due, $47,850. $47,000. I read the number 3 times, certain I was seeing things wrong. The letter went on to list years of accumulated fees, late penalties, interest charges, and violation fines. Some of the violations were ridiculous. Unmaintained fence line, unapproved exterior color, failure to maintain landscaping standards. I called the phone number on the letter immediately. A woman answered with a bored, bureaucratic tone. Cedar Valley HOA, this is Janet. There has been a mistake, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I just inherited property at 1247 Old Ranch Road, and you sent me a bill for almost $50,000. My property is not part of any HOA. All properties in Cedar Valley are automatically included in the HOA, Janet replied without emotion. Your property has been delinquent on fees since 2018. The previous owner ignored all our notices. The previous owner was my great-uncle. He owned that land since the 1960s. There was no HOA when he bought it. The HOA was established in 2017 when the Cedar Valley development was approved. All existing properties within the geographic boundaries were automatically enrolled for continuity of community standards. I felt like I was falling down a rabbit hole. You cannot just decide that someone's property is part of your HOA without their consent. Actually, under state law, we can. The county approved our expansion to include all properties within a half-mile radius of the development. Your property falls within that boundary. I hung up the phone and immediately drove to the ranch. I needed to see this supposed development that had somehow trapped my family's property in an HOA contract we never signed. What I found made my stomach turn. Just half a mile from Uncle Harold's ranch, construction crews were building a massive subdivision. Hundreds of identical houses, all painted in the same boring beige colors. The development stretched for miles, with perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. But the worst part was the sign at the entrance. Cedar Valley Estates, a luxury planned community. Below that, in smaller letters, managed by Cedar Valley Homeowners Association. I drove back to the ranch and called the estate lawyer immediately. They cannot do this, I told her. They cannot retroactively force someone into an HOA. Actually, she said slowly, they can in certain circumstances. When a county approves a large development, they sometimes grant HOAs the authority to include surrounding properties to maintain aesthetic consistency across the area. But Uncle Harold never agreed to this. He never signed anything. That is the problem with these expansion clauses. Property owners do not have to agree. The county makes the decision based on zoning and development plans. I spent the next week researching everything I could find about HOA law. What I discovered was terrifying. In many states, HOAs have powers that rival local government. They can place liens on property, foreclose on homes, and even force sales to collect debts. Property owners have very few rights once they are trapped in the system. I pulled out the accumulated fee calculation and went through it line by line. The base HOA fees were $300 per month, which seemed outrageous for a rural property that received no HOA services. But the real killer was the penalties and interest. Every month of non-payment added late fees, penalty charges, and compound interest. What started as reasonable monthly fees had snowballed into an impossible debt. The violation fines were even worse. The HOA had apparently been driving by Uncle Harold's property regularly, documenting every perceived problem: peeling paint on the barn, fence posts that needed replacement, wild grass that was not properly maintained. Each violation carried a $100 fine, plus penalties for noncompliance. I realized that Uncle Harold probably never even knew about these charges. He was in his 80s, living alone, dealing with health problems. He might have thrown away the early notices, thinking they were scams. By the time the fees had accumulated to serious amounts, he was probably too sick to fight back. The final page of the letter contained the most terrifying part: notice of intent to place lien. If payment is not received within 30 days, the Cedar Valley HOA will initiate lien proceedings against the above property to secure collection of outstanding debts. I had less than 30 days to come up with almost $50,000, or they would put a lien on my family's ranch. Money I did not have, for debts I never agreed to, imposed by an organization I never joined. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Uncle Harold, spending his final years alone on the ranch while bureaucrats in suits slowly built a legal trap around his property. He had died thinking the land was safe, that he was passing down a debt-free legacy to his family. Instead, he had unknowingly left me a ticking time bomb. The second letter arrived exactly 1 week later. This time, the tone was different, aggressive, threatening. Final notice of outstanding fees. Amount due, $49,200. The balance had grown by over $1,000 in just 1 week. Late fees, penalty charges, and interest were accumulating faster than I could even calculate. At the bottom of the letter, in bold red text, "LIEN proceedings will begin in 21 days." I called the HOA office again, hoping to reach someone reasonable who could work with me on a payment plan, or at least pause the accumulating charges while I figured out my options. This time a man answered. "Cedar Valley HOA, this is Robert. I need to speak with someone about setting up a payment plan for property at 1247 Old Ranch Road," I said. "The current balance is growing too fast for me to handle, and I need more time." "No payment plans," Robert said flatly. "Full payment only. You have had years to take care of this debt." I just inherited the property 3 weeks ago. I had no idea this debt even existed. "That is not our problem. The debt follows the property, not the person. You inherited the property, so you inherited the responsibility." I tried to explain the situation. Uncle Harold was elderly and sick. He probably never understood what was happening. The fees were ridiculous for a rural property that received no HOA services. The violations were for conditions that existed before the HOA was even formed. Robert cut me off. "If you cannot pay the debt, then you should not have accepted the inheritance. We have legal authority to collect what is owed, and we will use it." I hung up feeling sick to my stomach. These people were not interested in fairness or reason. They were debt collectors with legal authority, and they clearly saw my ranch as an easy target. That weekend, I drove to the ranch to think. As I walked the property, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. Someone had been there recently. I found fresh footprints around the barn and evidence that someone had been taking photographs. I was looking at the footprints when I heard a car engine. A white sedan pulled up to the farmhouse, and two people got out. A woman in a business suit and a man with a clipboard. "Excuse me," I called out, walking toward them. "This is private property." The woman looked at me with cold eyes. "We are conducting a compliance inspection for the Cedar Valley HOA. We have legal authority to access the property for documentation purposes. You do not have my permission to be here." "We do not need your permission," the man with the clipboard said. He was taking photographs of the farmhouse, the barn, and the fence line. "The HOA covenants grant us access for inspection and violation documentation." I watched in anger as they spent 20 minutes photographing every imperfection they could find. Loose boards on the barn, chipped paint on the farmhouse, weeds growing around the wellhead. They were building a case against me, documenting violations to justify even more fines. After they left, I found their business cards on my windshield. The woman was Margaret Chen, HOA compliance officer. The man was David Rodriguez, HOA board member. On the back of David's card, he had written a handwritten note: "Property sale recommended to resolve debt issues." Property sale. They were not just trying to collect money, they wanted me to sell the ranch. That night, I researched both of their names online. What I found made everything clear. Margaret Chen worked for a property management company that specialized in HOA enforcement. David Rodriguez was listed as a partner in a real estate development firm. These people were not just collecting fees. They were in the business of forcing property sales. The HOA was a tool to pressure landowners into selling, probably so their development company could buy the land cheap and build more subdivisions. I realized I was not just fighting a debt collection. I was fighting a coordinated effort to steal my family's property through legal manipulation. The next morning, I found another letter in my mailbox. This one was from a law firm representing the Cedar Valley HOA. Notice of lien filing. Lien amount, $51,750. Your property will be subject to foreclosure proceedings if payment is not received within 10 days. They had accelerated the timeline. I no longer had weeks to figure this out. I had 10 days before they put a lien on the ranch, and once that happened, they could force a sale within months. I needed a lawyer fast. I spent 2 days calling every property rights attorney within 50 miles of Cedar Valley. Most of them had never dealt with HOA expansion cases. The few who had experience were either too expensive or too busy to take my case quickly. Finally, I found Sarah Martinez, a solo practitioner who specialized in property disputes. She agreed to meet with me on short notice, and I drove to her office with boxes of documents and a growing sense of desperation. "This is a complex case," Sarah said after reviewing my paperwork. HOA expansion laws vary significantly by state, and the courts generally favor established organizations over individual property owners. But there might be procedural violations we can challenge. She explained that my best chance was to prove that the HOA had not followed proper legal procedures when they expanded to include existing properties. If they had failed to provide adequate notice to affected landowners, or if the county had not properly approved the expansion, we might be able to void the entire arrangement. "How much will this cost?" I asked, already knowing I could not afford it. "To fight this properly, You are looking at $15,000 to $20,000 in legal fees minimum. If it goes to trial, it could be much more. I felt my heart sink. I was already facing a $50,000 debt I could not pay, and now I needed $20,000 more just to fight it. The system was rigged against people like me. There is another option, Sarah said carefully. Sometimes these HOA cases are part of larger patterns. If we can find other property owners in similar situations, we might be able to build a class action lawsuit. That would split the legal costs among multiple plaintiffs. I agreed to pay Sarah a $5,000 retainer to begin researching the case and looking for other affected property owners. It was money I could not afford, but I was out of options. While Sarah worked on the legal research, I started my own investigation. I drove through Cedar Valley and the surrounding areas, looking for other properties that might have been trapped by the HOA expansion. What I found was disturbing. The Cedar Valley development was huge, stretching across several square miles of what used to be rural farmland. But scattered throughout the development were older properties, original farms and homesteads that predated the subdivision, and many of them showed signs of distress. I found abandoned houses with overgrown yards and boarded windows, properties with "for sale" signs that had been up so long they were faded and weathered. One farm had obviously been vacant for months, with unmowed fields and livestock fencing that was falling down. At the county courthouse, I researched property records for the area. What I discovered made my blood boil. Over the past 3 years, more than 20 properties had been forced into sheriff sales due to HOA liens. Properties that had been in families for generations, sold for fractions of their actual value to pay HOA debts. And in almost every case, the properties had been purchased by the same buyer, Cedar Valley Development Partners, LLC. I researched the LLC and found that it was owned by a group of investors that included several members of the Cedar Valley HOA board. David Rodriguez, the man who had been photographing my property, was listed as a managing partner. They were running a scam. Use the HOA to impose impossible debt burdens on existing property owners, force them into foreclosure, then buy the land cheap through sheriff sales. It was legal theft, hidden behind legitimate-sounding procedures and bureaucratic language. I brought this information to Sarah, who was equally outraged but not surprised. "This happens more often than people realize," she said. "HOAs have enormous legal powers, and when those powers are abused, individual property owners have very little recourse." Sarah had found 3 other property owners in similar situations, all facing HOA liens for properties they had owned for decades before the Cedar Valley development existed. We decided to file a joint lawsuit challenging the legality of the HOA expansion and the validity of the liens. The legal process moved slowly while my personal situation got worse. The 10-day deadline came and went, and the HOA filed their lien as promised. Now my ranch officially had a $50,000 debt attached to it, and the clock was ticking toward foreclosure. I attended my first HOA board meeting in hopes of speaking directly to the decision makers. The meeting was held in a conference room at a local hotel, and I was shocked by what I witnessed. The board members were clearly running a business, not a community organization. They discussed properties like inventory, referring to acquisition targets and conversion timelines. When I requested time to address the board about my situation, they initially refused. Finally, they allowed me 3 minutes to speak. I explained that my property had been in my family for 60 years, that we had never agreed to join the HOA, and that the fees were impossible for a rural property that received no services. Margaret Chen, the compliance officer, responded without emotion. "Mr. Thompson, your property is subject to community standards regardless of when it was purchased. The debt is legitimate, and the lien is enforceable. If you cannot pay what you owe, we recommend you sell the property to resolve the matter." David Rodriguez added, "We have investors interested in purchasing distressed properties for fair market value. We could connect you with someone who might be willing to take on the debt as part of the sale." I realized they were offering to buy my property themselves, probably for pennies on the dollar. The whole system was designed to funnel land to their investment group. "I will not sell my family's ranch to pay debts I never agreed to," I said firmly. Margaret Chen smiled coldly. "That choice may not be yours to make much longer." 3 weeks later, Sarah called with devastating news. Despite our legal challenges, a judge had ruled that the HOA lien was valid and enforceable. The court found that the county had properly approved the HOA expansion, and that property owners were responsible for all accumulated fees regardless of when they acquired the property. "We can appeal," Sarah said, "but that will take months and it will not stop the foreclosure process. They can move forward with selling your property while the appeal is pending." I was out of legal options. The system had failed me completely, and the vultures were circling my family's land. 2 days later, I received the final notice. "Sheriff's sale scheduled. Your property will be auctioned on the courthouse steps in 30 days to satisfy outstanding HOA liens." Sarah called me at 7 in the morning, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. Her voice was tight with urgency. "They moved up the auction date," she said. "Instead of 30 days, they are selling your property in 1 week. They filed an emergency motion claiming you were damaging the property to avoid paying the debt." "That is completely false," I said, feeling panic rising in my chest. "I have not damaged anything." "I know, but they submitted photographs showing broken fence posts and unmaintained structures. The judge approved the accelerated timeline." I drove to the ranch immediately. Walking the property with fresh eyes, I realized what had happened. The damage they were claiming was normal wear and tear that had existed for years. Fence posts that were weathered but functional. Barn boards that were old but structurally sound. They had photographed every minor imperfection and presented it as evidence of property destruction. It was a setup. They wanted to force the sale before I could organize an effective defense or find the money to pay the debt. I spent the next few days frantically trying to raise money. I called every family member, every friend, everyone I had ever known. I applied for loans, tried to mortgage my city house, even considered selling everything I owned. But $50,000 might as well have been 50 million. I could not raise that kind of money in a week. The night before the auction, I could not sleep. I sat on the farmhouse porch where Uncle Harold had spent his final years, looking out over land that had been in our family for 60 years. Tomorrow, strangers would bid on our legacy like it was a used car. The auction was scheduled for 10 in the morning on the courthouse steps. I arrived early, hoping to see who would be bidding on my property. What I found disgusted me. There were only 3 people there besides the auctioneer and court officials. David Rodriguez from the HOA board, a woman I had never seen before, and an elderly man who looked confused about why he was there. David saw me and walked over with a smug expression. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. I am sorry it came to this, but you had plenty of opportunities to resolve the debt." "This is theft," I said. "You know exactly what you are doing." "I am participating in a legal auction," David replied. If you cannot afford to maintain the property, someone else should have the opportunity to develop it properly. The auctioneer called everyone to attention at exactly 10 o'clock. He read the legal description of the property, mentioned the outstanding lien amount, and announced that bidding would start at $25,000. $25,000 for property worth over $300,000. The elderly man immediately shook his head and walked away. He had obviously been there by mistake. That left David Rodriguez and the unknown woman. "Do I hear 25,000?" the auctioneer called. David raised his hand. 25,000. The woman hesitated, then raised her hand. 26,000. 27,000, David countered immediately. The bidding continued slowly, with David and the woman going back and forth in $1,000 increments. But something felt wrong. The woman was not really trying to win. She would bid just enough to keep the auction going, then let David outbid her without much effort. At $32,000, the woman stopped bidding entirely. David had won my family's ranch for $32,000, less than 10% of its actual value. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder number 3 for $32,000, the auctioneer announced. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But Sarah had warned me that any disruption would only make things worse. The sale was legal, even if it was morally disgusting. After the formalities were completed, David approached me again. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that we plan to develop this property responsibly. It will become a beautiful extension of the Cedar Valley community." "You stole my family's land," I said quietly. "I purchased it legally at a public auction," David replied. "If you had managed your finances better, this would not have happened." That afternoon, I did some research on the woman who had been bidding against David. Her name was Patricia Wells, and she was listed as an employee of Cedar Valley Development Partners, LLC, the same company that David Rodriguez owned. The auction had been completely rigged. They had planted a fake bidder to make the sale look legitimate, but David was always going to win. They had probably done this dozens of times before, stealing property from families who could not fight back. I called Sarah and told her what I had discovered. She was outraged but not surprised. "This is fraud," she said, "but proving it will be extremely difficult. They will claim Patricia Wells was bidding independently, and we would need evidence of coordination between them." "What about the accelerated timeline, the false damage claims?" "Those are procedural issues we might be able to challenge, but the sale has already happened. Even if we prove misconduct, the most we might get is financial compensation. Getting the property back would be nearly impossible." That night, I sat in my city apartment feeling completely defeated. In less than 2 months, I had gone from inheriting my family's legacy to watching it stolen by criminals hiding behind legal procedures. The system was designed to protect people like David Rodriguez while crushing people like me. But as I sat there in the darkness, something began to change inside me. The grief and shock were giving way to anger, cold, focused anger. If the legal system would not give me justice, I would have to find another way. I became obsessed with exposing what David Rodriguez and his partners had done to my family. If I could not get my ranch back through the courts, at least I could make sure they paid for their crimes. I started by researching every property transaction in Cedar Valley over the past 5 years. I spent hours at the courthouse, going through public records, mapping out patterns of ownership and sales. What I found was even worse than I had imagined. Cedar Valley Development Partners had acquired over 40 properties through HOA liens and foreclosure sales. In every case, the pattern was the same. Established properties with long-time owners suddenly faced with impossible HOA debt, followed by rushed auctions where the development company was the only serious bidder. I created a detailed spreadsheet tracking each transaction. The purchase prices were laughably low compared to actual property values. A 60-acre horse farm sold for $18,000. A historic farmhouse on 10 acres went for $12,000. My ranch, at $32,000 for 40 acres, was actually one of the higher prices they had paid. But the real smoking gun came when I researched the HOA's financial records. As a property owner who had been subject to HOA authority, I had legal right to review their books. What I found made my blood boil. The Cedar Valley HOA was collecting over $2 million per year in fees from the subdivision residents. Their actual expenses for community maintenance, administration, and services were less than $800,000. They were generating over $1 million in annual profit, and that money was being funneled directly to Cedar Valley Development Partners as management fees and consulting services. The HOA was not a community organization. It was a profit center for David Rodriguez and his investment group. They were using homeowner fees to fund their property acquisition scheme, stealing land from long-time residents to expand their development empire. I reached out to other families who had lost property to the same scam. What I heard broke my heart. Elderly couples forced out of homes they had lived in for decades. Young families bankrupted by legal fees trying to fight impossible debts. Children who lost their inheritance because their parents could not understand the complex legal maneuvers being used against them. One woman, Maria Santos, had lost her family's farm after her husband died. The HOA had imposed $70,000 in fees and violations while she was dealing with funeral arrangements and grief. By the time she understood what was happening, they had already filed for foreclosure. I tried to fight, Maria told me through tears. I hired a lawyer, I went to every meeting, I begged them to work with me. They did not care. They wanted my land and they were going to take it no matter what. Another victim, James Parker, had owned a small cattle ranch for 30 years before the Cedar Valley development surrounded his property. The HOA had fined him repeatedly for agricultural odors and non-conforming land use, even though his ranch predated their subdivision by decades. They made it impossible for me to operate, James said. Every month brought new fines, new violations, new legal threats. I could not afford to keep fighting, so I sold to them for almost nothing. 30 years of work gone. As I gathered more evidence, I realized that David Rodriguez and his partners had made a critical mistake. They had been so successful for so long that they had become careless about covering their tracks. I found email communications between HOA board members discussing target properties and acquisition timelines. I discovered bank records showing suspicious payments between the HOA and Cedar Valley Development Partners. Most damaging of all, I found recorded minutes from a private board meeting where they explicitly discussed using violation fines to pressure property owners into selling. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed help presenting it to authorities who would take action. Local law enforcement was useless, probably because David Rodriguez had political connections in the county. I needed to go higher. I spent weeks researching which state and federal agencies had jurisdiction over HOA fraud and property crimes. Finally, I connected with an investigator from the State Attorney General's office who specialized in real estate fraud. Detective Lisa Chen, no relation to Margaret Chen from the HOA, reviewed my evidence and was immediately interested. She had been tracking similar schemes in other counties and suspected that Cedar Valley was part of a larger network of fraudulent HOA operations. "This is exactly the kind of case we need to build precedent," Detective Chen told me. "HOA fraud is a growing problem, but most victims do not have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. Your documentation could help us shut down this entire operation." Working with Detective Chen, I helped set up a sting operation to catch David Rodriguez and his partners in the act. We identified an elderly property owner who was facing similar HOA pressure, and Detective Chen arranged for undercover agents to document any attempts at coercion or fraud. The sting worked perfectly. David Rodriguez personally approached the elderly property owner with an offer to help resolve his HOA debt by purchasing the property at below-market prices. The entire conversation was recorded, providing clear evidence of the coordination between the HOA and the development company. With federal wire fraud charges now possible, Detective Chen obtained warrants to search Cedar Valley Development Partners' offices and seize their financial records. What they found was a massive conspiracy involving not just property theft, but tax evasion, money laundering, and bribery of local officials. The investigation was building toward criminal charges, but I wanted more than just punishment for David Rodriguez. I wanted my ranch back, and I wanted compensation for all the families who had been victimized by this scheme. Detective Chen smiled when I told her my goals. "Mr. Thompson, when we are done with these criminals, property recovery is going to be the least of their problems." The arrests happened on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months after I had lost my ranch at the rigged auction. I was not there to see it, but Detective Chen called me as it was happening. "We just arrested David Rodriguez at his office," she said, barely containing her excitement. "Margaret Chen and 3 other HOA board members are being booked right now. We also have warrants for 2 county officials who were taking bribes to approve fraudulent HOA expansions." The charges were extensive: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, tax evasion, and violation of civil rights under federal housing law. The state attorney general held a press conference announcing that Cedar Valley was part of a statewide network of fraudulent HOA operations that had stolen over $50 million in property from unsuspecting families. The criminal case moved quickly once the arrests were made. Faced with overwhelming evidence and federal charges that could result in decades in prison, David Rodriguez and his partners began making deals with prosecutors. They agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation and provide restitution to all victims in exchange for reduced sentences. The civil recovery process was more complicated, but ultimately more satisfying. A federal judge ordered the immediate reversal of all fraudulent property sales conducted by Cedar Valley Development Partners. My ranch, along with 38 other stolen properties, was returned to the original owners or their families. But getting the property back was only the beginning. The court also ordered full financial restitution for all victims, including compensation for legal fees, lost rental income, property improvements made by the fraudulent buyers, and emotional distress damages. My settlement totaled over $400,000, more than the ranch was originally worth. Maria Santos got her family farm back, plus enough money to modernize the operation and ensure it would remain profitable for her children. James Parker recovered his cattle ranch and received additional compensation that allowed him to expand his herd and build new facilities. The criminal sentences were severe enough to send a message to other potential HOA fraudsters. David Rodriguez received 12 years in federal prison. Margaret Chen got 8 years. The corrupt county officials received 5 years each and were permanently banned from holding public office. More importantly, the case resulted in new state legislation requiring strict oversight of HOA expansions and giving property owners stronger rights to challenge retroactive membership. The Cedar Valley Act became a model for other states dealing with similar problems. 6 months after the arrests, I was back living on Uncle Harold's ranch. I had used part of my settlement money to renovate the farmhouse and update the infrastructure. The barn was repaired, the fencing was replaced, and the property looked better than it had in decades. On quiet evenings, I sit on the same porch where Uncle Harold spent his final years, looking out over land that almost slipped away forever. The sunset still paints the sky in shades of orange and purple, but now I appreciate it with the knowledge of how precious and fragile our rights really are. I learned that ordinary people can fight back against institutional corruption, but only if they refuse to.